The previous episode ended with Ian slapping Lena and saying to her, "Lena, just because I've been reduced to a 9-year-old girl's lapdog, am I no longer your king?" But she started trembling and said to him, "You'll always be my king, your majesty." Then Ian told her, "Don't disobey me." And she replied, "Of course I won't, your majesty." At that moment, the doctor came to see Elizabeth, so the maid said to him, "This way, doctor. I'm sorry for calling you at such a late hour, but Miss Elizabeth is having another coughing fit." The doctor replied, "Yes, let's hurry then." Here we learn that afterwards, the Viscount's daughter was ill for another 3 days. It had been 4 days since the young lady had been confined to bed. Ian went to Viscount Rowott, who said to Ian, "The reason I accepted you was because that child wanted you. Without her, I would have sold you again, or even killed you on the spot." Ian thought to himself, he says that while clearly not loving his daughter. And here, Rott continued saying, "Your arrogant attitude and glances didn't bother me, but I had to make an example of you because there are other servants watching. You are a defective product that cannot be fixed, so I don't care to know your past. You're nothing more than a black dog sold to me by a slave trader. And considering you must have lived on the streets digging through the trash, you shouldn't be angry about your current situation. And serving a noble should be a welcome duty for a slave after all. So be a good sport and enjoy it. And it doesn't matter because she won't live long anyway. But she has to stay alive until she's old enough to bear me an heir. Therefore, don't let her get sick again ever. She is nothing like her father at all. So does she resemble her mother, who remains confined to her room?" The founder of the Rott family was the first Travista slave to receive a noble title after leading the kingdom to victory during the most brutal Maxman War. So to think that his family has now fallen into such misery, what bad luck. Here, the scene changes to the servant opening the curtains and saying to Elizabeth, "Madam, are you feeling better today?" And Elizabeth said, "A little," and the servant, "I'm relieved to hear that. Yesterday your father summoned that terrible boy who made you sick." And Elizabeth said nervously, "He did?" And the servant said, "Yes." So Elizabeth asked nervously, "Did father punish him severely?" Here, the servant said, "Of course! That slave dared to disobey his master. I'm sure your father made sure to teach him a lesson." And Elizabeth screamed nervously and said, "Bring that boy here now. I need to see him myself." And indeed, Ian went to her with Lena. And here he said to Elizabeth, "Did you call for me, my lady?" And she looked at him nervously, saying to herself, "What? He's fine." Then she said to him, "Yes." Then she looked at him carefully and continued, saying to herself, "In addition to that, he's wearing clean clothes and his bruise is gone. Has he also grown and become a little taller?" Then she looked at Lena and continued, saying to herself, "This one still follows him, even though I never invited her either, and it seems as if he has become a different person while I was sick in bed. Now I feel stupid, because I worried about him, and I wanted to be the one to treat his wounds and make him feel warm." And here, she began to tremble and continued, saying to herself, "I wanted to do everything for him." So in anger, she threw the pillow and said, You fool." And Ian said, "My lady?" And Elizabeth said to him, "I want to ride a horse." And Ian said, "All right, I'll call someone to take you." But she refused and said, "No, don't." Then she looked and pointed at him, saying, "You," and here she said, "I want you to carry me on your back." This made Lena stand in front of them and say, "What are you saying?" So Elizabeth started crying and said, "Be quiet. This is none of your business. Don't interfere. I didn't call for you. Get out. Get out now." And Ian, so she wouldn't get sick again, went to her and wiped her tears, saying, my lady, please calm down. You'll get a fever again." Then he knelt on his knees and made a horse. So Lena was shocked, but Ian didn't care and looked at Elizabeth and said, "Please, my lady, please ride your black dog. Please, come on. If it's too high for you to climb on your own, I'll lift you up." But Elizabeth said nervously, "No, not like that." Then he knelt down and said, "No, wait." And here Ian began to move with her, while Elizabeth felt sad and said, "This isn't what I wanted. I just wanted to get rid of that girl who always follows him." At this time, Lena started crying and trembling from what was happening to him as she looked at Elizabeth. So Elizabeth said to herself, "What the hell? Why is she looking at me like that? I'm her lady, so I'm allowed to make him do something like this." But I knew that crawling on all fours like a dog was humiliating even for a slave. Indeed, after issuing an impossible order, I would have a fit of rage while the servants would look at me in confusion and fear, until my maid and nurse would come to calm me down, and only then would I tell them what I really wanted. And so, I always got what I wanted in this castle. And I was planning to do the same thing this time and wanted to demand that they get rid of that girl and that I play with him alone. So I got off his back and said, "I'm done." And Ian said to her, "Didn't you enjoy the ride?" But she said to him, "No, I hated it." Then she began to tremble and said to herself, "Just like when I gave him some milk, and even today, why don't things go the way I want?" And here she started crying and said, "You're mean." And here Ian looked at her and said to himself, "In moments like these, what did this girl's nanny do again?" And here he remembered when his servant carried her and said to her, "It's okay, my lady. Those bad people upset you, didn't they?" So he went and carried her too to stop her from crying and said to her, "It's okay, my lady. That bad girl hurt you, didn't she?" And here she started hitting him and said, "No, I hate everyone." But she suddenly stopped crying when he said to her, "So, do you want me to put you gently on the bed?" And here she said to him, "No, don't do it. Don't put me down. Hold me tight." And here Ian said to her, "Yes, my lady." Then he started wiping her tears and said, "I'll hold you tight, so stop crying." And she said to him, "I'm not crying." But Ian said, "But your face is a mess." And here Elizabeth closed her eyes and said to him, "Ian, I'll call you Ian." And when he apologized to her, she said, "It's the name of a handsome knight. My nanny used to tell me a bedtime story about a knight. In the story, the knight defeated an evil beast and saved the princess. He was always noble and without flaws." Then she laughed and said, "Ian suits you better than Black Dog." And here Ian looked at her and said to himself, "At times like these, she's really an innocent little girl. So does her moody and difficult personality come from her need for affection because of her parents' neglect?" The Count had no expectations for his daughter. So she forgot her lessons to become a suitable heiress, and she wasn't even disciplined to become a decent human being. And this was despite the fact that girls had the right to inherit wealth and noble titles in Trevista. Lena was a clear example of that, and the reason for the Count's cruelty towards his daughter was her weak health. And if she died before reaching adulthood, the wealth and status that the Rovati house had maintained for decades would return to the royal family. And so, the Count's only goal in keeping his daughter alive was to produce an heir. In other words, he didn't care what happened to her as long as she stayed alive. And here Elizabeth grabbed him and said, "Ian." And he replied, "Yes, my lady." And Elizabeth said to him, "I want that girl to go somewhere else. Can't I convince my father to send her to my grandfather?" And here Lena looked at her angrily, while Ian said to himself, "The Count asked me to please her and keep her happy.